If you've ever listened to a gripping true crime report, scrolled through an article about a major court case, or even just sat down to sign a standard contract, you've definitely run into it. I'm talking about the incredibly specific, sometimes intimidating language of the justice system. The legal world doesn't really use everyday English, does it? It has its very own specialized pairings of words. We call these collocations, and they dictate literally everything, from how a brand new rule is formed all the way to how a serious crime is punished. So welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to completely decode that precise language together. To do that, we'll be moving through 4 key stages: making and respecting laws, navigating rules and regulations, investigations and trials, and finally, verdicts and consequences. Now, the source material we're working with today is this incredibly detailed mind map of legal vocabulary. Basically, it outlines exactly which verbs and nouns legally belong together. I know, it can look a bit overwhelming at first glance, right? It's like a giant puzzle. But don't worry, we're going to transform this dense map into a compelling, chronological story. We're going to untangle these terms so you can see exactly how they operate out in the real world.
Let's jump right into part 1, making and respecting laws.
The life cycle of a law starts from its absolute inception. You see, you don't just make a law in legal speak, a new law is introduced or passed. Our source gives a highly relatable example here. Introducing a law forbidding the use of mobile phones while driving. Makes sense, right? Once that boundary is set in stone, it becomes the responsibility of all of us citizens to act within that law. But let's be real, laws are totally meaningless without a bit of muscle behind them. That brings us to the final step. It's the job of the police to uphold or enforce the law. That means they make absolutely sure that people are actually listening and doing what the rules say. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Notice the shift in register here. In everyday casual speech, you might hear someone say that people who refuse to obey the law should be punished. It definitely gets the point across. But when we step into a more formal context, the vocabulary elevates. In a courtroom, you wouldn't just obey, you must observe the law at all times. And observe here doesn't mean just watching it happen from the sidelines, it means strictly adhering to it. Recognizing this subtle difference between informal and formal phrasing is an absolute game changer for mastering legal communication. And hey, this extends straight into the corporate world too. As our source notes, take a look at this phrase. The company acted within the law as regards the rights of its employees. That is a highly formal sentence. You see, corporations don't just follow rules. They must meticulously ensure their operations act within the law. It implies a careful, calculated adherence to an established legal framework. All right, so let's step down from those massive, broad societal laws to the more specific rules that govern our daily lives.
Which brings us to part 2, navigating rules and regulations.
Specific rules dictate specific actions, and they use specific verbs to do it. A new regulation doesn't just stop something from happening, it forbids or prohibits it. Think about a sign prohibiting smoking in public places. On the flip side, rules permit or allow certain things, like permitting club members to bring guests on weekends. Furthermore, these regulations don't just exist in a vacuum. They apply to targeted groups. Our source notes, for example, that certain rules might apply to all students rather than just the new ones. And ultimately, if we follow the rules, a certain outcome is expected, like requiring 20 people to be present to hold an official meeting. Just like laws, rules have their own sliding scale of formality. On the super formal end, regulations stipulate or require that students register. Or, in a highly technical setting, you might have to comply with the regulations concerning the testing of equipment. You have to do exactly what the manual says, no exceptions. But on the informal side, well, human nature creeps in. Sometimes we want to break a rule in a way that isn't really considered malicious or a big deal. That's when we bend the rules.
You can almost hear the hushed, slightly informal tone in this source example. I hope we can bend the rules and let her take the exam on another day. It's a pragmatic, very human approach to a rigid system. Bending the rules is all about finding a tiny bit of flexibility where, formally speaking, there really shouldn't be any. But what happens when someone doesn't just bend a minor rule, but completely shatters a major law?
That takes us to part 3, investigations and trials. The chronological flow of a criminal case kicks off the moment the police carry out an investigation. Our source gives us the scenario of a major theft at a factory in Woodvale. Once the investigation concludes, key players, like witnesses, must appear in court. Following that, the accused individual must go on trial.
Finally, after what could be days of deliberation, it is up to the jury to reach a verdict. It is a highly precise four-step journey from the scene of the crime all the way to the final decision. Listen to the phrasing in this dramatic scenario from our source. George Arthur Lode, accused of murdering his wife, went on trial today. Did you catch that? You don't just go to trial in the legal phrasing, you go on trial. It places the subject directly under the glaring, harsh spotlight of the justice system. The stakes literally could not be higher.
And actually, speaking of that harsh spotlight, our source brings up a fascinating real-world challenge regarding the concept of a fair trial. It uses the scenario of a man named Harold Graves. The text explicitly notes that it now seems impossible that Harold Graves can receive a fair trial, given the intense media publicity surrounding his case. This highlights a massive issue. The legal system absolutely demands impartiality, but the court of public opinion? Yeah, that often makes a fair trial exceptionally difficult to achieve. So, the jury has spoken, which brings us to our final section, verdicts and consequences. This is where the vocabulary directly mirrors the stakes. The severity of an offense directly correlates to the harshness of the consequence. Look at the escalation here. If you commit a minor infraction, like parking on double yellow lines, you pay or face a heavy fine. Escalating that up to shoplifting, a judge might decide you should be severely punished. But at the absolute highest, most severe extreme, if someone is found guilty of murder, they might have to face the death penalty. The verbs themselves escalate right alongside the crimes. Now, when discussing that most extreme consequence, the source text introduces a vital concept, the idea of something acting as a deterrent. A deterrent is basically a measure intended to discourage people from doing something out of fear of the consequences. As the text objectively points out, people often support the death penalty specifically because they argue it acts as a deterrent. So it's a preventative kind of logic that's baked right into the vocabulary of punishment itself. Ultimately, the absolute blanket rule of the justice system is this. Anyone who commits a crime has to suffer the consequences. And, those consequences can be highly subjective depending on exactly who is sitting at the front of the courtroom. The text makes a point to note that some judges are simply more likely to hand down harsh sentences or a harsh penalty than others. The human element of the justice system is, for better or worse, inescapable. But before we wrap up, we should remember the legal system isn't only about crime and punishment. Consider a civil matter for a second. After a hard legal battle, she won compensation for the accident. Notice that specific phrase, hard legal battle. Even in civil court, for an accident, fighting for your rights is described as a grueling conflict. But the great thing here is that the sequence ends on a victorious note, with the phrase won compensation. So how exactly do you secure that victory? Well, our source text offers one final, highly practical piece of advice. If you are going to have any hope of winning your case, you will need a very good lawyer. The vocabulary of the law, as we've seen today, is intricate, precise, and completely unforgiving. Navigating the whole shebang alone is a tremendous risk. So we've covered a lot today, decoding the exact collocations from introducing a law all the way to reaching a verdict. And I want to leave you with this thought. Every single day, we interact with these unseen legal boundaries. The next time you encounter a rule, you have a choice to make. Will you strictly comply with the regulations, or are you willing to suffer the consequences? Thanks so much for joining me on today's Explainer, and keep learning out there.